Robert, how are you?
Very good. Nice to be on the show.
I'm excited. You had reached out and actually your agency, and Krista's awesome, by the way. There's a lot of the podcast brokers out there, and most of them are worthless. And I love Krista. She brings amazing people. And so I listened and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so timely because about IP. And I was explaining to you, Robert, that every single time I do a keynote or a Vistage workshop, some people are like, how do you value IP? And should we be thinking about IP? And then I just did a whole podcast on AI and data security because it's out in the open. And I also care about IP because I've created a lot of it over the last 9 years. So I was immediately excited and jumped all over it. But it's not just IP. You have this whole different funding strategy behind IP that we're going to get into too. So for the listeners, why don't you just give us like a 50,000 foot overview of your background, Robert, and then we'll take the kind of the sequence of the topics that you and I walked over in that order.
So 25 years ago, I became a lawyer, a trial lawyer in the IP space. And I had the good fortune of representing companies that built industries in America that had fundamental technology, the wireless in your phone that makes the physical become digital, turns it into invisible waves of energy, and at the speed of light, it makes it around the world. Amazing. We take it for granted, but if we think about what's going on, we realize
kind of a big deal.
So I had the good fortune of representing the company that developed that, the PCR technology that you know today, because you took the test, the COVID test, and that actually won the Nobel Prize in chemistry, to next generation electric motors, to smart cards, semiconductors. So I like to say I've played heavily on the hardware side of the house, and venture capital is on the software side of the house. But I began my career helping these companies, many of them who either built industries or lost their opportunity. And usually the difference was in being smart about how you protect what you have early on. And believe it or not, the paradox is actually looking to license and share it so you can create value around the world. Because otherwise people think about copying it, and they will if it's got enough value, or they try to come up with a better way, a better mousetrap, an independent development. And that's no good if you've put a lot of time and money in. So I did a lot of that. And I used to cry over the young companies that literally, like it really used to hit me that these young companies would lose their advantage because it's hard to get capital, hard to get venture capital for hardware. Ever since we went digital with the internet, and every business model was being digitized into a new startup, right? That would bring you that software solution.
Which is just a comment on that, Robert, too, which is so fascinating too, because back, I can only imagine a couple of decades ago when it was all the VC capital was flowing towards hardware. I mean, like you needed $5, $10, $30 million to spin up a data center, like in order to even launch your idea. So like now it's like the software is just for labor to code. It's just an interesting, like you need it now more than ever, but it's all flowing towards software.
Exactly. And so these hardware companies that really built the empire, right? Planes, trains, and automobiles, we shared that technology around the world. I like to say the first empire in the world that didn't take the wealth of others. Historically, that's how it worked, the land and resources. We actually create innovations that made it more productive to do everything. Software is a great one, right? Mm-hmm. Online, e-commerce, internet, wireless connects the world with these smartphones. And now the world is your customer base, right? 8 billion people. So wonderful innovations, but it all starts in hardware. Software is a great accelerant and productivity enhancer, but unless you have fundamental hardware to bring disruptive change, the software really will have limits in what it can do. So venture capital, as you noted, has moved away because it is $100 million to build a chip, or $50 million to build a factory, a production line to make any kind of product, not just computer hardware. When I say hardware, I mean anything physical based on breakthrough innovation. So I went from the wireless to the PCR, that won the Nobel Prize, to electric motors, semiconductors. And what I saw was companies that shared, number one, in some controlled way, they weren't just a charity, optimize their business for where they had the manpower, the business plan, and the capital that they could get from venture capital, but then shared with others around the world, meaning one venture becomes many ventures in effect, right? Other investors in other parts of the world with teams that can build that same new car with that IP engine, that great engine, right? And so those guys would succeed. Qualcomm's a great example of that. Absolutely a great example. They made wireless voice more reliable than any other carrier in the world, and they've reaped the benefits. They have a chip business and they have a licensing business. You have to license the use of your phone with their chip. But they enabled so many companies to build businesses and create jobs. PCR, same thing. Wireless, same thing. So I realized there's a giant hole in these markets. And I took my IP capital model, which looks at the IP as a property, like real property, but I know it's not fixed in one place. It can create value wherever it goes, and realized I could take one venture and turn it into many, build the top line faster, grow the business faster, have more impact in the world, jobs, and depending on the tech for humanity in other ways, energy, housing, et cetera. And I could de-risk the business. Now I'm not betting on just one team, right? I've got many bets placed. And so venture capital has moved to software where they do those many bets across unique ventures, and they value the venture, not the IP, right? And they have a valuation model that works for software where capital is light, early revenue, the valuation can be low, but the capital need isn't so high that you're taking away most of the equity. Move to hardware, as you said, and I've got a lot of CapEx that I've got to invest to build a product. And early revenue, I've got a challenge because I can't get that venture-like value, and they ignore the IP value, and that results in an inability for hardware companies to grow and thrive. So I created IP capital, which is venture capital that values the venture and the IP and looks to scale the use of that IP. One venture becomes many, as a way to solve a lot of this problem that was standing in the way of these companies growing, because you and I want to bring our manufacturing base. It's a national security risk here in the United States. It's also a way to create lots and lots of jobs that software does not. And so I realized that it's hard for venture capital building 10-year funds to just shift gears back to hardware, which is where the industry began, right? The empire began, the venture capital industry began. And so it really needs a new model and somebody to spearhead it. We call it IP capital, but again, it's a new kind of venture capital. We value the venture as well as the IP. We don't ignore that. And that's how we get around this problem of taking way too much equity for the entrepreneur.
I love it. I love it. I love it so much. I'm so excited because, and we're going to unpack this so that way by the end of this conversation, I hope that the listeners in and tuning in will understand the difference of your IP capital compared to the VC capital and like how it's going to be influential. Because I also think, I'll say this, kind of put a pin in this, but like, with the music that kind of stopped this last 18 months, Robert, I mean, the companies that were VC backed, and I've got family members working for VC backed companies where it's like, you missed it. It's kind of like, all I want to say is you missed it. But like, so now it's like to shift the model to like, you're going to go for a cash flow valuation is like almost ludicrous thinking, but there's IP in there. So let's put that aside, because I think you and the model and how you are approaching this is very intriguing. But let's start, not to be too basic, but I want to get us all on like same level playing field for terms, concepts. Let's talk about the different types of IP. What should people be thinking about when we're talking about IP?
So I try to dispel a misconception, and that is sometimes people can think of the IP rights that protect your technology as the IP. In the legal world, it's often used synonymously, but it's really the IP is the technology. When we think about and hear about China stealing our IP, we're talking about the technology. We're not talking about the patents or the trade secrets. Well, those are rights legally that protect you. But it's the technology that we're talking about. And now you're investing in disruptive technology, breakthrough innovation that changes the way we make a physical product. Instead of bits, it's atoms, right? Is a cute way to think about it. Instead of software, it's hardware. Instead of digital, it's physical. And so when you venture out into the world with something breakthrough and you recognize there are 8 billion people in the world, and to keep it in your pocket, build your corporate stores, because that's all you have capital to do. Typically, if you can get venture capital, because it's so expensive and so dilutive of your equity, if you can get that capital, now you've got to think about how do you protect if you're going to go out into the world and actually scale, turn that one venture into many, license, franchise, how do you protect? And that's where you think about patent rights. We call that IPR, trade secrets. How do you make sure you're going to be able to have different aspects of not only the breakthrough innovation, but the innovations that cascade along and how to manufacture it? It could be new equipment to make it. There's a lot of follow-on innovation from a plane, a train, or an automobile to actually go make that plane, train, and automobile. And then you have to think about, how do I protect it? Do I keep it secret, a trade secret? And what do I need to do to maintain that secrecy, right? One, of course.
And would that be like a Coca-Cola recipe?
Correct. And I like to tell people, even a Warren Buffett is an IP investor and people don't realize it. He bets on companies that may not have a technology advantage, but they have a process IP advantage. They can deliver a product more efficiently. And in the case of Coca-Cola, I call it a process or a recipe for making Coca-Cola. One of his, he'll tell you, he rode the American tailwinds. Innovate here, spread it around the world. That's what I'm talking about. He was an IP capitalist, if you wanted to call him that.
Yeah.
And he realized I could take that Coca-Cola recipe when I bought Coca-Cola. I could go around the world, and depending on the foods you eat, it changes the taste of the Coca-Cola here in other countries. So they tweaked and adjusted the recipe, and there are different recipes for different parts of the world.
No joke. I didn't know that. That's why it actually tasted different. Now, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Now the question is, how do you keep it secret, right? And so that's one way. Now, you always keep things secret if you believe that you can keep them secret, because you want to have a good 5-year run to reap the benefits for your investors, because it takes that long for a real fundamental technology. Once it's been proven to work and you're beginning to enter the market to really get traction, people don't like change. And so when you bring something new, no matter how valuable it is, it will take some time for it to gain traction, to hit that tipping point where it will go viral. So you want that longevity. And if you feel that keeping it secret will be a challenge, and there are all different reasons why that might be the case, and you believe somebody can get access to your product, whether illegally or legally, they can go buy it on the shelf, right? And reverse engineer what you're doing. And they can do it pretty quickly. Software struggles because it's so easy to replicate software. It tends to be more incremental. That's why VCs are challenged today, and returns for investors. That's why Silicon Valley Bank was on the throes of disaster a few months ago. The model is too crowded with too many people chasing too few good deals in an incremental world where it's easy to copy, replicate, not just copy,
would you also say
replicate.
too few ideas, Robert? Like when I was watching your clip on, I can't remember which news clip it was, but you were saying that I resonated so much. We're like, Uber Eats, we're still just getting food delivery. Uber is still just a cab. Like it's not like we're doing things really that differently. There's things that are more convenient incrementally, to your point.
And they took advantage of hardware inventions, wireless in your phone.
Right.
With satellites, right? Those are all hardware inventions that now made it possible to automate that business model, like you said. Delivery of food,
would you agree or disagree with this? Because I think the software that went in, and really what a lot of these software platforms were doing, were taking advantage of this through the digital communication and all the IP you talked about. They took advantage of a mismatch of a supply and demand, where there was a lot of supply of people's empty cars and a big demand, and whoop, now you get the supply and demand that's more matched, but the good or service is still there. Is this still the same?
And the point is, you hit it on the head. Anytime you can automate something in software, and bring enough of a value prop for people, make it easier for people to connect and to consume, whether it's a mismatch between supply and demand, as you've described, which it is. It's like ZocDoc for doctors in New York. You just plug it in, you can figure out who's available. That's hard to do in some cities, right? You got to wait weeks to get a doctor. So automating through software is a wonderful tool, but if you're investing in it, even the best company can be usurped, beaten out, because there'll be many, where there's McDonald's, there'll be many customers, Burger King, Wendy's, I like to use as a cute example. So too few good ideas probably isn't that there aren't plenty of ideas for how to automate everything we do today as a business or a consumer. Many, many ideas, but too few breakthrough ideas, because when it's incremental, as an investor, you're challenged in that competition can show up and eat your lunch. When you're in the world of physical technologies that are based on deep science and engineering, they tend to take years to develop, long development cycles, and take lots of capital. And so it's hard for people to just simply catch up, right, in a year.
Oh, if any, yeah, and like all the books that I've read, Robert, about like, all Walter Isaacson's books about the code breaker, about the mRNA technology, and anything in the biotech and sciences, it's like, if you like, from an outsider, just listening or watching the amount of fights between the people that invented the technology to the investors around the patents because of exactly what you're talking about. It's like, no, this took us 30 years to develop. I'm not just going to give up right now.
Exactly. So I got in the business because I saw venture moving away from hardware investments. That's where I was helping young lawyers. When I was an IP lawyer, I was actually an investor, but I was helping them license their tech. Many companies who had developed fundamental technologies that created industries couldn't survive in a sea of large companies. Big Oak, Shade, everything. It's in their, it's in their DNA to maintain the good that they have. And they often will look at what you're doing and do it themselves. They've got more capital, manpower to really execute where you can't. And so with VCs moving away and manufacturing going overseas, it became more and more difficult for a hardware company, a physical product company, to survive in the US market. And that's a challenge. So I came in and saw that many of them were being stolen from. I couldn't help them. And I thought, instead of coming in on the back end and trying to help them and their investors reap some benefit from all of the risk and capital over usually a decade of its breakthrough before you hit the market and the market takes off, I thought, I need to get in the game. I've heard their complaints. I've heard their concerns. Come in with a better model that doesn't dilute the equity of the entrepreneur, that values the IP, not just the venture, right? Which is one of the ways to skin that cat.
Yep.
And then shares in revenues, because if they have enough of an advantage, they'll have a contract base and enough durability in that advantage that you can now move to a real property-like investment style where you're sharing in revenues, at least some minimum dividend to get paid to wait. You're no longer forcing them to exit prematurely, right? Either an IPO or a sale, because you're a venture capital fund and the 10 years is up and it's, in or out, or you won't get the next fund. So I give them the luxury of being able to build that business and take it wherever they want it to go, knowing I'm getting a minimum dividend along the way and watching the equity, much less equity than a venture capitalist would take, grow in value. So the entrepreneur now has that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow with my model. Investors now have a piece of the action, so to speak, a dividend along the way, right? And they are, not wedded to the timing of any particular exit. And for everybody, both the entrepreneur, and we'll break this down, and the investor, looking at the venture as not just a venture with a team and a business plan, but a brand new engine or a brand new piece of hardware that nobody else has that delivers value you can't get. Like NVIDIA's GPUs. Nobody can get GPUs that can do what they can do. The world is waiting for production because they all got their AI ready to run on those GPUs. So the point is, you've got durability, you've got a breakthrough that gives you an advantage nobody else has. That becomes a risk mitigator to that business, unlike in software, right? You're not worried about competition, number one. Number two, you've got a backstop on your investment. We hold the assets as collateral if the business were to fail, as opposed to just assuming we're zeroing out and tolerating lots of losses like in a venture model. So I create more of a real property model where the property generates rents from use of the property. Here it's use of the IP, flows to investors, some minimum dividend, so you're paid to wait. The property is valuable enough when valued and you look at its liquidation path to protect you from the downside. And then I'm helping these guys think about the 8 billion people in the world they can deliver value to. And instead of building corporate stores and keeping that diamond in their pocket, sharing it through licensing, joint ventures, creating many ventures. From one, I'm building the top line and I'm further reducing the risk. Yeah.
And you're building an ecosystem that, like, I mean, I don't know if this is too cliche, but I mean, it's the Apple store, right? I mean, like, you have all these people building apps that are all making money, or Amazon. I mean, my God, I've got some exposure, Robert, into the online space, the Amazon FBA aggregators that were just buying these. I mean, all of that market is because of Amazon, to your whole point, right? Like that, none of that would have been around. So if you have an ecosystem that is, back to your point about Warren Buffett being an IP capitalist, it's the moat he's always talking about. And Robert, this is why I say it correlates so much with our philosophy, because of intentional growth by creating an asset. I mean, it's about the reality of creating future sustainable cash flows. That's the whole point. And it's this whole thing that we need to create equity value based on future cash flows. And what you're doing is you're allowing the probability to the economics to be matched up with actually launching the product or service instead of just being a financial engineer.
Correct. And so in venture capital, when you lose true innovation as your advantage, then you have to financially engineer growth. That can be blitz scaling the company so you take market share because you've got pools of capital at different stages so you can accelerate the path of your startup versus the other startups that only have early stage investors and need to find that next stage, right? So you can win just because you've got the vertical model to take them from farm to table, from soup to nuts, right? Mm-hmm. And that is how they grow. They're being attacked in the press for predatory pricing strategies. I saw some articles on that. And it's not that venture capital isn't doing the world a great service. They are, but they're too focused on software and they're struggling as an asset class. Mm-hmm. The ones that have verticalized are doing fine. The many that have not, who are niche, because when you're in a crowded field, what do? You specialize. And when you specialize, there's too many people trying to chase too few good deals, I like to say, that really have an advantage. And valuations go up, irrational valuations have we seen with Uber and other companies when they go public, right?
Oh, and then, WeWork, case in point, right?
Yeah, WeWork is a great one. Yeah.
Well, and I think very, very, I love it. So let's go back to so when I think about valuations, I'll kind of explain how I describe this in my conversations, and you can kind of take that and lift off of it. It's like, so when people are always ask me, Robert, like how does IP get valued in a deal? Because then I want to talk about, after we talk about this, I think we talk about then how do people create IP? How do they spot it? Then what do they do about it? Because I think this is something that everybody can act upon, and not just the software companies like you have proven, which I love.
Right.
So what I always say, Robert, is because intentional growth, when we talk about viewing a company as an asset, these are founders that are not backed by VC or PE. So this mindset of an asset is not like ingrained right off the bat. It's like they found an opportunity or product or niche and they've built a sustainable business off it. But now we're trying to help them say, hey, this thing is like, play the game that everybody else is playing, like private equity, venture capital, to understand how to grow value. So that I help people try to understand valuations by a simple thought process, Robert, that is like the intrinsic financial value is the value of your asset based on the risk of the future cash flows as it stands today, right? So when people are like, well, I've got IP. So like, but when I'm explaining to someone, I'm like, hey, let's say you're doing, just make a dramatic example, like 5 million in revenue and a 500 grand in cash flow. And you're like, well, I've got IP that's worth $30 million. And I'm like, but the cash flow valuation, you're still only making 500 grand. Like at the end of the day, that company is only making 500 grand from the cash flow financial valuation. If someone wants to buy that IP for $30 million, they're buying IP, not your business that's a cash flowing asset. So what I was explaining is like, the IP has to be facilitating the generation of cash flow.
More cash flows, right?
More cash flows. Or because the whole philosophy, Robert, is that if the people listening to this philosophy, they can have as many choices without other people as they possibly can have. But if they need the money and they don't have enough time or capital, they're going to have to sacrifice the operations potentially to sell the IP to get the valuation that they want. So it's more this like strategic, like someone else is going to be grabbing that IP for their strategy instead of you and your strategy.
Right.
So I think, how do you feel about that?
I think you hit it on the head. In the end, cash is king. Cash flow as opposed to accrual tells you the truth, right? It's reality. And so with an asset, a new engine in a car, right? There are people around the world who can build cars, right? So why do I want to build my own factories, make my own cars, and not license others to build cars? I can grow my business more quickly. Now, you can make a choice. Tesla's done it, right? To build their own factories, right? Or you can share, and you need to make that choice. Apple made the choice to say
And
proprietary.
Well, and isn't Elon and Tesla now licensing their road charging to Ford
They
and the
are.
GM?
They are, right. And that's, like you said, to build the ecosystem. So everybody's using the charging system so you can scale that much more quickly, right? And it helps Tesla, right? Create value for others, you create value for yourself. People don't realize the more value I create for others, the more value I create for myself. And if I stay in a market of 300 million, conscious capitalism, and I don't realize there are 8 billion people I can deliver value to in the world, it's a fool's move to keep that diamond in my pocket. A fool's move.
Totally agree. I love it.
And then just to hit your IP point, it is about cash flows. So if you take what I've described, that IP will create cash flows through many other ventures, right? Through licensing, could be joint ventures. It really depends on the technology, how much assistance these companies in other parts of the world need. It may be a joint venture or a pure license, like a franchise, like building Starbucks around the world. But you're now going to value that asset based on its potential to create cash flows beyond the venture. The venture is always, if I just did my IP valuation on the cash flows the venture is going to create, well, it's not going to be any different. But if I could think of the property like a piece of real property, but instead of being fixed in one place with only so many units that can generate rent, right? That's like the venture. It's limited to the team and the business plan and what they can do with the capital they have. But if I realize that property here, the intellectual property, the tech can move and create value everywhere in other ventures, now we're talking about something, right? We're talking about many other cash flow streams. And that's how you get real value for IP. That makes a difference for a venture.
I love it. Let's take, before we go into like how we share it without sabotaging the work that we've done and to get to the point that you're talking about. So let's take current companies that and I think that this is what, for the listeners that are in, they have a current company for the most part, right, is someone that might have a cash flowing valuation that is not as high as what their IP might be. Like there are different strategies. Someone will say like, hey, take that IP and create an entity to protect it. Like, so what would be your thought about like, hey, a manufacturer or some professional services firm or whoever has got a good business, like a sustainable business that's not just a VC burning cash. Like they're a sustainable business, but they have this thing, this IP. How do you approach that to get the options that you're talking about?
Well, and you may have to ask maybe your question again, but basically, any company that has something that creates value, that IP can be packaged up just like a franchisor packages up its brand and its know-how on how to build the store, how to bring customers into the store. Well, on the physical side of the house, hardware, either the cost to make that, and a lot of these companies are now in the circular economy, reuse the waste, or reducing carbon emissions, et cetera. People will pay a premium for it, or that hardware can deliver value. You can do more work per unit of time. So these technologies, anything that creates enough value to be breakthrough, you essentially want to help that manufacturer realize that with the right strategy of licensing and franchising and packaging up that IP, you essentially can bring the manual and the parts and show them how to get in the business. And probably you're going to make some of the critical ingredients in your corporate stores so that you're not giving away the farm, right? So it's one of the protective mechanisms that you want to practice. And those will change, but that's how I look at it. And what you will typically do is you will hold the intellectual property rights to using the technology in a separate entity owned by the manufacturer, and you'll create a licensing of the technology with support from the manufacturer. That's one way to do it. And now you're getting a toll on revenue, just a simple licensing fee like a bridge or road or tunnel gets built today. It's a toll on revenue, typically is the way they get returns. Or you can enter into a joint venture, right? Because they need much more support, right? Capital maybe, and they need you along to get this thing up off the ground, this manufacturing line or facility. And there you'll be sharing both in a royalty from the use of your IP plus a share of the profits. And that profit split will depend on what people are
Negotiations, yeah.
contributing, what the risk profile is. Many different factors will determine how you split that.
Got it. And well, I think regardless of what direction, whether someone were to bring on an investor that's an IP capital investor like yourself, or they just keep it as is, waiting for options, maybe to get a knockdown on the door for an out of the blue offer. But no matter what, structuring it like that, I think gives people options to explore and wait for things to kind of happen to figure out which direction to go. Is that a safe assessment?
Yeah, and it gives you optionality. You now have a separate. You own the thing. It doesn't matter whether the assets on paper, because physically there's kind of like all these capital leasebacks, right? The equipment never leaves the factory, but somebody on paper owns it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're really setting up an entity that on paper owns all of the rights to the technology, but the physical technology, other than a copy of it that's held, as security if there's a funding, IP capital funding or just a pure debt funding, but the physical assets themselves, the know-how, the technology, the designs to make the equipment, to make a product, the designs for the product that make it do something new and different, all that's still sitting in the factory, right? Effectively.
Mm-hmm.
And so the world treats American IP in particular as a very valuable asset. People don't realize that. And if you go around the world, you'll find that your IP assets, when licensed, those revenue streams are taxed at half or less of corporate profits. So there's also a tax advantage in thinking about your IP assets as a standalone asset pool.
Super interesting. And so I think that last part of the conversation that we just went over is good context to go back to when you had said you had separated the venture from the IP. You want to just go over that again? Because I think it's crucial, because I think it's that what we just went through, I think cements that.
So you separate the venture from the IP both conceptually, in that you don't look at the venture as a venture alone with a team and a business plan. You look at the technology as a property asset that is equally valuable, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if breakthrough truly valuable and should be licensed, in some cases not, you'll choose how you license. You'll profit optimize the ventures business. And where you don't have the time, the money, or the appetite for risk, why not license it? If you can do it in a way that protects what you have, you've got more cash flow streams coming, as you've described.
Mm-hmm.
Cash flow is king, right? And so, but in terms of actually separating them legally, it is usually wise to have ownership held by a wholly owned subsidiary that holds the IP. And the way you get paid is like rent on a real property. You get a share of the revenues from use of the property, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you want to do that because you still own it. It's still your holding company, but your tax obligations on those streams, because we want to encourage you to share that IP, is half or less of what you will be charged on profits if you're just building a corporate store, just thinking of this as a venture, and you're doing the business a disservice in just investing in the venture and ignoring the value and the fact that that asset is not fixed in one location and can create cash flows wherever it goes.
And make the biggest impact on the 8 billion people like you've been talking about too. Like if you think about just store by store by store, if Starbucks would have just went there, I think it's such a fascinating setup that you've got, because instead of just the cash flow valuation, you have the rent and the usage. So you have two. And is this a fair, how accurate do you think this statement is? Like if I go back to, like, let's say you got $1 million in cash flow, you say, okay, well, here's the cash flow valuation. You take it times by 7, let's say it's $7 million valuation on the venture. But now you got IP over here that's got a cash flow valuation potentially too from the licensing of the mothership.
Yeah, let's say there's 10 more of those $7 million streams, right? Now you've got $77 million of value for that business that in a venture model would only look like 7. And if you need 7 million, there goes half the company, right?
Right.
Versus 77 million, you're only giving away 10% of the company.
Yeah, and I'm assuming like it also creates so much flexibility too with potential acquirers. It's like, do you want the cash flow valuation? Do you want both? Because both is a higher multiple with a whole different deal structure versus just the IP. Because then you could still like, is it? I mean, do you see this too, where someone sells the IP and then actually just continues the license, and then they keep their cash flow valuation or their cash flowing entity just as they have been?
Yes. I mean, I'm trying to think of a good example for you. I mean, the music industry, that's how artists get compensated. They just license, somebody else distributes, sells, etc., and they get a total on revenue. They don't actually do anything beyond create the song, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or Qualcomm's a great example. They don't make the chip, they design the chip. They're an IP company, really, at heart. ARM, the processor in phones, the low cost, low energy processor.
How about Marriott? Doesn't Marriott
Marriott is a soft, I call it a soft IP. Now you're in the world of process, right? Brand and delivering a service better than somebody else, right?
Because they like don't own like any real estate, right?
They don't. They let that. Well,
Yeah.
they probably own their corporate stores, but
Right.
there are many, many more franchisees, and they realize that getting a total on revenue has very little cost to it and lots of profit to it versus building a factory and doing it all yourself, or building every hotel and doing it yourself. Or a lot of capex in that.
So let's go to then when people are looking to because a lot of our concept is like, what do you want out of this? So you could scale you could scale with your IP, you could keep your business. I mean, again, we're kind of laying out the different options here.
Yep.
Let's say they're going to want to sell their IP or sell their business or anything, or their IP.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about, and we can figure if we want to inverse these topics, but I'm thinking about the risk of due diligence or having conversations with potential acquirers around IP. And like I had a very 10 years ago, Robert, almost when my father and I sold our company, we sold it to a strategic buyer that like the customer list was our IP, but also then there was all this managed IT offering, like with processes,
it's all IP,
procedure.
right?
Yeah, it's all IP. And so like we already, like when we were in the deal, like people started chatting, we're like, they're talking, you know what I mean? So like there's the risk of getting your IP stolen, especially when you talk about software, people doing code due diligence. So how do you, when you're selling or looking to sell, protect your IP in that process? And then we can talk about in general as you're scaling the ecosystem or sharing.
Well, you have a challenge when you're entering into an M&A with somebody, right? Because you can have an NDA in place, but I think that you go through that process in stages. The business has an outward, just like when the body is not feeling well, it outwardly shows things, right? And a successful business will have customers, it will have revenues, it will have profits, and that's what's attracting you to buy the business, as well as the technology that enables that. Now, the question is you really want to get to close to the finish line with anybody before you let the keys to the kingdom outside your hands. And you want to try to make sure that it's pretty challenging to back away from the deal that's been inked, at least in a term sheet, because you are at risk if you share it. What's in the mind is hard to separate, even though there's an agreement that says I shall not use it, right? Yeah. Challenging to prove it. And people will come up with all creative ways to capture the essence once they know the secret sauce, and then literally maybe not even capture the true secret sauce, do a flavor of it. Now you're in the world of, is it the same or similar? And should I be compensated for that, act of that, right? And it's often challenging to prove somebody copied it. Very, very challenging. And, young startups who go to raise money really run into this problem. They do lots of meetings. They think the world is like the field of dreams. If you build it, they will come, and they go and they share their genius
to like 100 people. And yeah.
And next thing you know, and I've seen this in my earlier life as an IP a lawyer, trial lawyer, protecting companies that built industries who did not reap the benefit of their technology because it was so easy, especially in the hardware side, once that big company that's already got fabrication facilities, manpower, lots of money, once they know how to make that product, right? What that tech is, what the secret sauce is, it's going to be hard to catch up. And there's a mantra in the big company world that has become commonplace. It's called efficient infringement. David is unlikely to take on Goliath because it's the sport of kings to afford to be able to do so. And even if he does, the system has changed over the past 10 years since the, quote, America Invents Act. It's kind of an oxymoron that makes it easy for somebody to come back over and over again to the patent office and say, hey, these patent rights should be relooked at. I believe they're invalid, and delay that process. So even if David could find the money and the great lawyers to go ahead and take on Goliath, he has to worry about the time that it takes to get his day of reckoning could be too long. He can be irreparably harmed. He is out of the business. And so that's one of the challenges. And so protection goes when you're an IP capital investor, that moat that Warren Buffett talks about, it can be through long development timelines. It can be through large capital. It takes years to catch up. Intellectual property rights, patents, trade secrets. There are different ways to do it, and you have to protect that asset if you really want to reap the benefit. There's too many people that are economically advantaged that it's hard to stop what might happen. So.
I hope you're enjoying the interview with Robert. I wanted to do a small interruption in order to let you know that if you're fascinated with this concept of intellectual property and how it's valued, the best way to better understand this is to better understand valuations and the two main types that we talk about in the Intentional Growth Academy, which is one, the cash flow valuation, which we talk about the intrinsic financial value, and by de-risking that future cash flow compared to the strategic transaction, which is when a buyer wants to come in and buy your company for a specific reason, aka your intellectual property. And I really dive into multiples and EBITDA on both of those different types of valuations. And I think that that would complement our discussion around how IP capital fits into what we talk about in the Academy. So go check out the Intentional Growth Starter Kit or jump right into the Intentional Growth Academy. It's $1,500 for the do-it-yourself. Or if you reach out and schedule a discovery call and you're interested in a complimentary financial assessment for your company, we will actually give you the Intentional Growth Academy access for free. So I appreciate you tuning in, and I really hope that you enjoy the rest of this interview with Robert Cote on intellectual property and IP capital. I love it. I love how you actually broke down the different ways to protect that moat, Robert,
Right.
because everything that you're talking about is enhancing what we talk about, creating future sustainable cash flows. And like, it's so like, I'm curious. Never mind. I don't want to digress too far. I want to move on to like how people can create this ecosystem. So we talked about mergers and acquisitions, and you obviously have a buyer that needs to see the IP if they're going to write a huge check for it. But over here of scaling with your IP and licensing it to other people, I mean, what caught my eye is you said the easiest way to protect your IP is to share it was one of the cut sheets that you'd sent over. I'm like, that's fascinating. Yeah. Tell me more.
Paradox,
So, and I, what's that? Yeah, it is.
Paradox,
it is. Yeah. And so walk us through how someone would roll that out. We gave a couple great examples, but with the level of stages you talked about when you're selling, like how do you kind of approach that you don't get yourself in trouble?
Well, you know, on the M&A side, it's more challenging than on the licensing side, actually. Mm-hmm. But you want to have different levels of protection. You want physical. I'll call it the lock and key. You know, how do you control access? Technology. AI and IoT on your lines that will know whose finger or hand was in the cookie jar, right? Mm-hmm. Be cute about it. And then you want legal protections, which are patents, trade secrets, and you want sophisticated counsel who understands how to take advantage of the legal systems that will help you and to stay away and mitigate the risk of the ones that won't. And there are different ways, and we could drill down on each one. But you have to be looking at it that way when you're investing in a company to scale the use of its IP globally, right? As an investment thesis, what we call IP capital, or you're entering into an M&A. Again, each one of those elements can keep people honest. And again, I like to think that before the keys, I like to say that before the keys to the kingdom are handed, you better know you've got a deal. It better be pretty solid. You better have a very sophisticated legal protection scheme that keeps people honest, that makes them think twice, right? Before breaking that deal, now that they have the know-how. So it's wait until the finish line. All the outer reasons for buying are there. You can see it in the world. You want to buy that business, go ahead and buy the business based on its economics. And once we know we have a deal, we can start to let maybe one person or a limited group have access. And then we're going to control what they look at, et cetera. Strong physical protection of what they look at, what kind of access, technology protection, which will help us better see what's going on, what people are doing when they're looking at this. And then third, the legal protections, right? Or physical protections that make sure nobody's walking out with anything that they've seen. And once you buy the business, you own it. I've gotten the reward for the business I built. And so that's how I think about it. Again, physical, legal, and technology. Use all three of those to protect what you have. And if it's an M&A, wait to the finish line until you show the keys to the kingdom.
Love it. So on to the sharing then, because and as we kind of end probably with the bigger picture, like what can people do about this? I think it's I go back to, it's interesting. We've talked about VC and a lot of these different things. And I think Peter Thiel just keeps coming to my mind for some reason. The book 0 to 1, like going from 0 to 1 is a son of a gun, right? Because you invented something new where we've kind of, I don't know, you've been doing this a lot longer than I have, but like we've been chasing the same iterations. It seems like just different versions of the same ideas for the last 15 years. We're like, where are the new things? And we need more of the 0 to 1, which takes longer, which is the IP. We need more things. I think there's an encouragement we should all have to be chasing this idea like that.
So you hit it on the head. So Mark Andreessen Horowitz, after the dot-com bust.
I love watching him on podcasts.
Or dot-com boom, I should say, and then bust was formed. Many funds were formed to go bet on companies because they knew the internet. I could move everything onto the internet and access the world, right? Smartphones grew that access right around the world from desktops. And so they realized that every business and every consumer could use a software app for all the different things they do in their life. And you can create value from that. But your advantage, as we said, was not incremental. And to really move society and humanity forward, we need the physical technologies to grow and thrive. And if we're not funding them, we're actually stunning our long-term growth. And that's the challenge. Our big companies don't invest in that long-term research and development that brings breakthroughs. It's easier to build the next iPhone today. 14 now, I think we're up to.
Yeah, it's got a slightly
where I
better
know
camera.
what my cash flows are going to look like, and I know people are going to. Well, how many people are going to buy it? I know. Yeah, I know what I'm going to make, and that's an easier business. So we've moved from short-term investments and short-term gains that Wall Street can count on at a public company level. That on Wall Street through the incentives, right? If one CEO is playing that game, you've got to play it because otherwise your economics don't look good and you're out, right? Your job is threatened. And that's now pervaded the venture capital market, moving to software. And by the way, there's a lot of good that came from all of that, but we've ignored building things
it's
again.
The balance, right? And I think I love how you put that. I love how you said that, Robert, because I want to make sure that this is what I'm hearing it because I believe this, and correct me if you don't, but I think you are, is we need a balance of VC for software, but we miss the hardware because I don't know if it's the 0% interest rates for 14 years pushed so much money into VC, into PE that everybody was popping up a firm and then they're all chasing similar ideas. They're not going from the 0 to 1. A lot of these, so it's we're oblong. We're we need more back to the stuff that you're talking about. And I think it's the same thing with the infrastructure of the US, right? We need bridges. And if we don't have bridges, an Amazon truck can't go across it to give it to someone else. And we're missing that. And what's interesting, Robert, I can only imagine you're going to do very well because have you ever heard of the book Makers and Takers?
Yes, I have actually. Yeah.
Super fascinating. Finance went from 0.9% of GDP to 7%. And then like R&D for public companies went from like what, 4% or something like that of GDP down to like 0.5 or
Yeah.
something like that. It's because they're not doing the things that you're
Well,
talking about.
where
Because
did the money go over 10 years after the financial crisis? Share buybacks where
I
my
know, dude. I
shares,
know. I know.
right,
I know.
reduce, and my earnings over fewer shares create higher earnings per share, higher stock price.
I know. I was having this.
Financially engineered growth basically is what happened.
I know, and it's so it's again, like there's this whole. We need to be able to have the duality into it. Like we need software VC, we need hardware VC. But like I mean, you think why is Apple on Apple iPhone 14 and it's still just a better camera? Is because they spent 300 billion on stock buybacks. They didn't make anything.
Right.
But then there's people that need you and your capital and this philosophy to get like to give themselves the encouragement to create the IP to go from 0 to 1, Robert. And like I think
Correct.
about how like so all of our clients that we work with, the people that are listening and the people that see
Mhm.
my workshops and Vistage are like the backbone of America that I think of, Robert, because
Right.
they're like the couple million in revenue to a couple hundred million in revenue, not
Right.
backed by the professional investors. And they have, I think, here's my thesis is that a lot of these people have IP that they haven't quantified as IP, whether it's software, processes, machinery, hiring, whatever. And they just haven't gotten the playbook to do what you're talking about.
Well, right now they have equity capital and debt capital in the capital stack of every business. In the future, you'll have IP capital, where you actually separate out and value what you've got and how that asset can create cash flows beyond the business. And it will change the way that young companies get funded. It will allow more companies to grow because the value you're looking at not half the pie, the venture, the team, and the business plan, but the other half, right? That actually can create much more value than the venture itself, standalone, through many other ventures, right? If you're willing to share it in a controlled way. And I'm going to make one more point. This country was founded on an industrial base. We built things, planes, trains,
I know people forget that, don't they?
People do forget it. And we created jobs for people. We freed the world from tyranny, became a light that shines on the world, literally a light that shines on the world, a place where if you travel the world like I have, freedom still reigns. There's no question about it. We take for granted what we have in this country. Often, if we haven't experienced places in the world where that is not the case.
Mm-hmm.
And so that country began by just coming here from around the world with a whole bunch of entrepreneurs willing to create a better future for their children. I call it the immigrant mindset.
Mm-hmm.
We need to bring society back, our culture back from short-termism, short-term gains, short-term results. Everybody seems to be doing better than me on social media, right?
Yeah.
This incentive to go do that 0 to 1, to take that bet. Back to the immigrant mindset where I'm trying to actually be of service to my town, my community, my family, building a better life, thinking long-term growth, investing in breakthrough innovation that changes the way we make things, build things. That's what's missing.
It's so timely, man. Like I'm a big audiobook guy, and I don't know why I didn't. So Think and Grow Rich, you read that decades ago, but I just stumbled across the one that they just published, Napoleon Hill, with Andrew Carnegie's 17 interviews called How to Own Your Mind. I don't know if you've stumbled across that, Robert.
I've seen Think and Grow Rich, which he actually hired that author to go talk to many of the wealthy people in the world to figure out what it was that allowed them
to
do
it. Yeah. And so
I haven't seen that though.
The How to Own Your Mind, like Andrew Carnegie just beats into Napoleon Hill's mind. Creative vision is what created America. If you do not have a big purpose, creative vision, we're just floundering, and then you're going to want something from nothing. And I was just like, so fascinating. But what I think is so interesting, Robert, about this time is that what are the ways that we can encourage someone that, for example, maybe you have a $10 million home remodeling client that has figured out how to standardize their hiring process, or someone on their design phase, or you got some manufacturer that's figured out how to, do their Lean Six Sigma, bending steel. I'm just making up random ideas here, but like there are people that have companies that could like almost reassess what they're doing. Like, I think there's this process that I think is interesting, Robert, that a lot of entrepreneurs struggle to figure out what they're really good at unless they ask someone from the outside. So I don't know, is there a process that you are familiar with of how to identify IP and then how to actually share it with a potential future ecosystem?
Well, well, you hit me with a bunch of things in
I
there.
know,
I'm actually
sorry
gonna,
about that.
I'm gonna go, but which is fine. You know, I love it. I love talking about this stuff. So, what I'm going to say is, to your something from nothing. So, I believe that being an entrepreneur is something you're called to do, and we're all called to do something, however big or small it may be. And it starts by realizing when you're called, you feel that call, that pull, and to not allow fear to get in the way when you can feel it from the tips of your head to the top, from the tips of your toes to the top of your head. Take that leap of faith. But faith is a really important element because I like to believe that there's a guiding hand we can't see with our eyes. I can't touch it, feel it. I can't prove it to you, but I can tell you stories one day, maybe on another show, of kind of, was it dumb luck or divine intervention? I like to
Mhm.
think it was divine intervention. So when you follow your calling and you let go of fear and those old habits of thought, and you believe in the principle of faith that there's something guiding you, you can realize, I like to believe, whatever it is that you choose to have in life. I like to believe we come to earth to live a lifetime and to create. And earth is about creating something out of nothing. And the only way to do that where you're called is by having faith and believing, because you're being trained along the way to be worthy of what it is that you seek in life. You came here and the reward is actually in the ride. We always look back and wonder what's next, even though we were struggling to get to the top of the mountain. Once we're there, we wonder what's next. It's a surprising thing, right? A surprise. And so people need to realize that challenge goes hand in hand with that journey, that calling. And if you don't have faith and learn to fly when you can fly and when you can't, as Martin Luther King said, run. And when you can't run, you walk. And when you can't walk, you crawl. And somebody who sees that has a true calling, there's no plan B. And they feel so inspired by it. They keep moving forward because they see it as an adventure and they see the challenges as stepping stones to where they're headed, not roadblocks standing in the way.
I think it's the what you just laid out there, and you got that Napoleon Hill book, Robert. You would just eat it up, and the listeners and I can't say enough about it. And it's so crazy that he was around 100 years ago. And I bring it back up because
Yeah.
the phrase that I'm not, it's not mine. It's from him. It's like that is the way to a happy, fulfilled life. The journey, finding something that fulfilled, that big, that you can chase is what makes the whole thing fun, because then you're never wondering when it's going to be over because you're enjoying the whole thing. And this idea of going from 0 to 1 and creating something that hasn't been there is what's going to give people a big enough thing to chase that it's not going to stop.
And then I'll give you another way. I like to think that when one takes responsibility for themselves and listens to their calling, they'll learn, often in hindsight, looking back, right? As Steve Jobs said, he could see the dots connected that he couldn't see as he was moving forward. But looking back, there was a reason for everything in his life that got him from nothing to something, right? To use your phrase.
Mm-hmm.
I like to say that those who choose to take responsibility for themselves, which starts with following their calling when ready, will live happy lives. And those who take responsibility for others will live blessed lives.
I like it a lot.
Yeah.
It kind of goes into your, and I know we're getting short on time here, but I think the last concept I'd like to unpack for a couple minutes is to share with others and be responsible for others. I think that is a way of the way of being responsible for others is providing value to others of the IP that you have created and are licensing to them.
Right.
What are ways that people can, maybe kind of just two things, going back to my probably fire shot of questions, but just when someone has a company and they want to look back and say, do I have IP here? What are some
Right.
ways for them to think about what they might already have? And then when they look forward, what are some ways that they should think about how to expand that to the rest of the world?
I would say that it's a tough question. I would say that value is what you look for. All great businesses are based on delivering value. So anything that helps you create that value, even a customer list, a community that you've built, the proprietary manufacturing equipment you had to design to be able to build that widget. There's usually many, many elements that together create a value proposition, and maybe in subsets create value. So there can be different aspects of what you've created you could license in different fields in different ways. Often technology that's truly breakthrough has disruptive effect in multiple markets,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so there's different IP for each one of those markets, kind of like the chair. I
Yeah.
build a chair, it has a back, a seat, and four legs, and I can sit off the ground. And maybe over in some other part of the world, there's another market where they want the rocking chair, right? Just to use a silly example.
Yep.
And so there often are different ways of using breakthrough innovation. You want to start with wherever it is that you're taking that innovation, the reason you created it in the first place, and think about where are you creating value, what's driving that value, and every aspect of that is your IP, every aspect. And then you want to think about protecting it so you can go ahead and share it legally, physically, and through technology. And we can talk about each one of those elements. But one thing that I'd like to point out is that you need a system wherever you have those rights and you want to hold your IP that will protect that IP asset pool that you're sharing. You want a system that has strong property rights. And when Ronald Reagan became president, he created an appellate court called the Federal Circuit. And he realized having all these different courts around the country decide what property rights were valid and infringed or violated, and different laws, depending on the culture in that particular community, was getting in the way of progress. He created this appellate court called the Federal Circuit, and they began 30 years of pro-patent protection, pro-trade secret protection, pro-property right protection. You probably don't know this, but the America Invents Act that Obama enacted, while great for crowdfunding to help young companies grow, mostly software companies, was not very good for hardware companies building something based on breakthrough innovation, because it created what's called an IPR process, inter partes review. It's just a fancy name for being able to go back to the patent office and say to the government, as the defendant who has stolen or violated your rights, I don't believe these rights should have been granted in the first place. I think you got it wrong. This country's constitution actually in it says that the property rights of individuals need to be respected. It's in our constitution. It's one of the founding fathers' big deals. They put that in there because an individual had no opportunity outside this country until it was founded. And we've weakened our property rights protection in this system. Big tech has driven a lot of that change that created what is called the American Invents Act. Again, crowdfunding, great thing, new way to bring the people into growing the companies online funding. But the not so good was this process of basically saying that my government doesn't get it right, and I can go back over and over again to get them to challenge it. And if I'm somebody with something breakthrough and I'm David, not Goliath, I have a real problem on my hands, because it's more efficient to steal and have David figure out how to chase me. Because in the end, he's either going to lose, he won't be able to chase me in the first place, and when he does, I'll pay him trinkets on the dollar, and he'll be happy to some degree, but the opportunity for the nation of building a new business is gone. And that's what I don't like.
I was going to say, man, like the whole point is to give the investors confidence that if this takes 10 to 15 years, we've got the time as long as we've got the capital. And you just entered doubt into the equation, which doubt and investment theses don't really work out very well. So it just hampers innovation all over.
Well, so that's why we talk about, you want somebody super skilled at how do I protect? Because you can still protect and share. Physical, legal, and technology, right?
You've mentioned a couple of times. If you want to unpack a couple of those, you can.
Yeah. So technology can be AI and sensors on the manufacturing line that actually don't allow anybody except somebody with a secret key to see the recipe that is making the product or see the design. You cloak that, right? That's very important. Very limited access to the keys to the kingdom. Build half of whatever it is, half the cake here, and ship the major ingredients and somebody can assemble the rest. So that's the second way to do it. Physical lock and key, right? Practices that protect who gets access physically into your facility to watch and learn, right? You can learn and watch just by seeing what's happening. That could be a problem. And then legal strategy. So that's why I like to say that if you can keep it secret, you keep it secret, because protecting it with patents, you're sharing that knowledge with the world. And you get those patent rights to protect things that people can easily replicate by looking at your product and reverse engineering your product.
Like Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, or all those are coming up for either they're lapsing or like 100 years or whatever it was.
Right. There you go. Right. It will lapse. Right. That's copyright. So you get much longer. For patents, you get 20 years from filing. 10 years for breakthrough is what it takes, even a new drug, to actually get to market. And then you got 10 years to reap the benefits of the market. In the drug space, the law actually gives you a 5-year monopoly because of the capital has to go into finding a new drug. In the technology space, they don't. So you want that long development timeline, large capital requirements as a de facto barrier to entry. So you're looking for breakthrough innovations that have high barriers to entry, which is another way to protect, long lead times to develop and copy, a lot of capital that somebody has to risk in doing it. And then the legal rights, patent rights, understanding where you can protect, where to get patents. There's a whole strategy around using patents. So they're actually an effective tool that gets around the challenges. I highlighted the challenges because somebody who's an IP investor wants the strongest property rights for this country that this country can have, because this is the only empire, I believe, that was built in the world, not on taking the land and resources of others for millennia, but built on creativity by freeing the world from tyranny, bringing them to a place where freedom reigns and where they could be as creative as they wanted. And we built the empire by creating innovations, planes, trains, automobiles, again, that nobody else had, and sharing that technology with the world. People don't realize that by sharing with the world and opening up countries around the world to democracy and to access to their markets, we not only lifted up their markets, but we also created a consumer audience that could buy our goods. And so Warren Buffett likes to say it wasn't genius, it was riding on the American tailwinds. And we need those tailwinds to continue, or trouble's coming.
I love it, Robert. That was so, I echo everything. Like, I just, so well spoken, so well said.
Yeah.
I want to end with your IP capital model again, because I think we covered a lot of ground and gave a lot of context.
Right.
Now, if we think about someone's got a business or cash flowing business, the venture, as you talked about, the people, the business plan, the cash flow, and then this IP, and let's say they don't have enough capital to take that IP and do everything that we're talking about. So how do you fit the gap compared to what was the typical model where they kind of sell they look at everything at once? I know I'm asking you to repeat, but I think there's a lot of context that
I can cover it again. And I'm going to use venture capital versus IP capital. So if I value the venture, it's the cash flows that get created from the use of that asset, that IP property, the technology, and I'm going to value that business. If I don't separate out and think of that property, that intangible, well, it's not just intangible, it's physical. It's your new manufacturing equipment, know-how, product designs, et cetera, customer lists, all that it took to create that value that in the end is the reason that somebody wants to invest in the venture. But you don't want to just limit yourself to the cash flow stream of the venture and value it on that cash flow stream. You want somebody that can come in and invest in your business and help you think about, how do I think of my IP assets as a property, like a piece of real property? How do I go share that property, because it's not fixed in one place, with other ventures, other teams, either through pure licensing or joint venture partnerships, and have from the one venture with one cash flow stream, many ventures and many cash flow streams. So when we come in, we shift the way you think of a startup or an emerging company, and we look at the value in two ways, that is the fundamental way that you change the venture capital model. So that works well, or not so well, because the incremental change it makes it so easy for competitors to show up and eat your lunch. But that model works in software where the capital requirements are low and the valuation is early on when they're growing isn't essentially as a denominator with the capital going in as the numerator going to take away most of the equity, right? So you can get them started. If you go over to the hardware land, you need to start to separate the IP value from the venture value. It's the only way not to take away the equity that makes that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow possible for the guys that are going to go for years with nothing. People don't realize they hold all this value, but they can't liquidate it, right? It's paper value. And so that's where we start and we say, wow, if we can do that, we can take a lot less equity, half or less, number one.
Which is
crazy. We can
different.
now create a revenue stream that isn't just profits from the venture, but a toll on revenue from the other ventures that are being licensed. So I have two ways. I've got a cash flow stream, right? Sharing a revenue that pays investors to wait. I've got an asset with a lot more value than the venture alone because there's many other streams. So I don't have to take the kind of equity away from an entrepreneur so they can now build their business. So they're able to realize their dream. The investor is seeing a lower risk profile with many cash flow streams built around many different teams making money. And he's getting paid to wait. He's no longer forcing the entrepreneur to prematurely exit, sell the company, go public. The entrepreneur can control his own destiny. And so we think, again, of a venture as not just a venture, but an IP property. And we've moved the model to something like a real property where you're getting paid for the use of the property by many others. You're de-risking in that way, and you're allowing the entrepreneur to own much more of the business, and you're allowing the entrepreneur, because you as an investor are being paid to wait, to actually control the timing and the direction of his destiny. So we think it's a game changer, IP capital versus venture capital. And then finally, instead of assuming lots and lots of losses, which is what they assume, which also drives up equity, I've got to get a home run out of one company to make up for all the other losses. When we bet on these kinds of breakthrough innovations, if you can properly protect them and create these multiple cash flow streams, multiple ventures, you actually have not just de-risk by multiple ventures and de-risk by getting a share of revenue instead of waiting for the lottery ticket at the end, right? But you have a third way. That asset pool will have value, so you can underwrite that asset. It becomes the backstop. A further reason you don't have to take as much equity, because you're not trying to make up for an assumed model that says, I'm going to lose most of my bets. You're not going to lose most of your bets because you don't bet on something that doesn't have intrinsic value that somebody else would buy and pay for to get your capital back. Hopefully that helps kind of give you the
Robert, it was perfect. It was perfect because it just, like, our whole conversation gave context to why it now works. And I'm kind of my thoughts on this is like, I'm a junkie for incentive alignment. That's why I kept holding conscious capitalism up. I'm like, and why I've dove so much into macroeconomics and monetary policy and all this stuff, because it just, the alignment of incentive, what I'm hearing, you're releasing the shackles of the incorrect incentives that have hampered growth. And we want to release the creative visionaries of the entrepreneurial spirit to go from 0 to 1.
That's it. I'm breaking the chains that bind that creativity, that binds you, that holds you back. And there's more than the model. You know, I like to say, as I said before, we really need to have a push in the country, strong property rights, which is part of a cultural shift, to realize that if we want to keep the good thing going that we created over the past 200 years with new breakthrough innovations that make new things, build new things, and help the world, help humanity, and reap the benefits of the value we create around the world, we need to have strong property rights, number one. Number two, we need to bring back investors, this is what I'm doing, into the hardware space, into the physical space, And we already hear about it. We need to bring manufacturing back just as a national security issue. Well, what about those are the big companies coming home, right?
Yeah, right.
And we need the little growth. We need the new growth, the new forest, right? If we stunt the growth of the other half of the equation, the brand new breakthrough, game-changing hardware innovations that allow us to do things differently, more productively in ways that were not possible. Just like the plane, the train, the automobile. Think about the commerce.
Well, I mean, I could name, you got the nuclear fusion, the quantum computer. I mean, we got plenty of things we need to tackle.
Oh, right. Maglev trains. There's all kinds of trains that could move people from one place to another. People don't realize even the highway system in America was an innovation that allowed communities to now trade,
talk,
right?
Yeah, right.
Even the internet has that, right? Communities can now trade anywhere in the world. But if we're ignoring the physical side of the house, we're ignoring a big piece of the reason that we're prosperous. And if the rest of the world holds the manufacturing base and the rest of the world is innovating in an environment where they have access to that manufacturing know-how, they have a huge advantage. And so what you're seeing is just like a great basketball team, it's challenging you as another great basketball team for talent, right? And so we're not funding our hardware companies, right? Because we've moved our manufacturing overseas. It's very expensive to build that infrastructure for a young company. Where do you think the talent is going to find the money and the know-how and the partners?
Right. Well, I didn't even go to this, Robert.
They're leaving.
If we don't get our what together, we are going to be the ones paying a license from someone else instead of us charging someone else.
No, exactly. And the reality is again, I'm going to go back to my principle that by creating value for others, we create value for ourselves. And the more value we can create for others, the more value we can create for ourselves, our nation, our families. And we want to realize that when we go license others and give them access to what we invested in with high risk capital, because we have a culture that's built on being entrepreneurial. Just coming here was a courageous act, right? 200 years ago. That culture, that immigrant mindset, we need to reinstantiate it. We need to instill it over social media into the very fabric of our nation. Our nation needs to understand we need to go long, not short. We need to have an immigrant mindset, not what's in it for me now, an instant gratification mindset.
Something for nothing.
Right. And we need to help these young hardware companies stay home. And we need to recognize by doing it, we're not just going to help ourselves. We're going to go do what we did for 200 years. Yeah. We're going to share those innovations, and people all around the world live better lives because of all that innovation. And yes, they are competitors today. Well, what's wrong with a competitor? Why should I, because I reap the benefits of sharing and created opportunity for myself, why should I deny another basketball team the right to compete? What it means is that we got to go long again. We can't run short because we've got guys that are going long all around the world that didn't exist 20 years ago.
And I'll add an analogy and then we'll wrap up is the point of a pickup basketball game is to keep playing, not to win.
Oh, interesting. Yes. That's
the journey, right?
Yes.
And the moment, and so we need competition because if we don't have the competition, we're just sitting there by ourselves and who cares?
Exactly. And, there are examples like NVIDIA with the DPU and the GPU. Data processing unit is a new chip in the cloud, a DPU that they use to do all the post office work. When you're doing AI, you need billions of data points. You needed a new chip. That new chip in the cloud, along with NVIDIA's GPU, is going to replace all the CPUs and servers in every data center with GPUs to do all the AI machine learning, and DPUs to suck in the fire hose of data in billions of bits per second.
Wow.
Are being trained. You're training an intelligent model to become smarter and smarter at billions of data points per second. CPUs and software running on CPUs in these data centers can't do it. So NVIDIA is a great example. And I think I heard the number from the CEO, Jensen Huang, of $300 billion over 30 years invested in creating the foundations for what will be the new data centers in the world that will, in software. Without that hardware, there would not be this AI software. Every piece of software will now have an AI engine behind it to make it smarter and more productive. So every business will be able to do more, and every consumer will have access to much more than they have today. And then I'll add on one note, one thing that really is important to realize, that a lot of the hardware innovations are all around sustainable technologies. Believe it or not, enormous demand in the world to go green. And green is no longer good for the environment, just good for the environment. It's good for people too, and for businesses. So if you're a capitalist, you want to have the best of both worlds. If the market is there and people are willing to pay a premium for it, we'll invest in sustainable technologies. That's spawned in every industry. Technologies to decarbonize our industries, pollute our water streams, and then circularity, reuse their waste in ways like the junkyard, where I can buy it for pennies on the dollar, turn it back into brand new and sell it for the same price. What a great business, right? Look at the profits in something like that. So people don't realize that green is a revolution in and of itself, driving the hardware side of the house in the same way that AI is driving the software side of the house. And they will go hand in hand, because if you think about it, AI is another innovation that drives sustainability. If AI comes into the picture, I can do things with less resources more efficiently, and that's just sustainability. So all this climate change we hear about, all this, focus on green is now becoming an economic value proposition that makes sense for people, businesses, investors to invest in. And the kind of the residual of that is, we're going to help the world. We're going to help humanity. And another reason we need to pay attention to the physical side of the house. So,
Robert, this has been a blast. I have learned a lot, and it's very fun hearing your philosophy and what I grab onto for core principles be highly aligned. Two last questions for you.
Sure.
The first one is, I ask people what the word intentional means for them, because it's the name of the show, and I've heard a lot of very fun answers to it. So I'm just kind of curious, what does the word intentional mean for you?
Intentional growth means that you actually have a vision and a plan to execute on that vision, and you're not just hacking at it. And that starts with having a calling, as we talked about, letting go of the old to let the new in, and having faith, and recognizing that intention has to be matched with faith that says, this is an adventure. Happiness is in the ride. The more value I can deliver to others, the more blessed my life will be, not just happy. And people need to realize that faith goes hand in hand with seeing the challenges along the way that will train you to get where you are as stepping stones to where you're headed, not roadblocks. I call that all intention. To me, intention and faith kind of go hand in hand. Intention has to be faith. Without it, it's really hard to build a business. Don't even start if you don't have that kind of intention.
Otherwise, you're just going from 1 to 2 instead of from 0 to 1, right?
Correct. No, you absolutely do. People have no idea. I can tell you personally, and then seeing it in my own life, there is no easy road from 0 to 1.
There's no road, right? It hasn't been done yet.
Right. And the world resists change, right? Think about it.
Yeah.
Nobody wants new, and you need that tipping point. But from the beginning to that tipping point is quite a journey. And if you don't have the courage and the emotional constitution and the belief that you've been called to do this, it's very, very hard to be successful, because it will be no walk in the park. For sure.
Amen to that, my friend. Last question is, where can everybody find you if they want to reach out and get in touch?
Well, a couple of places, Cote Capital, COTEcapital.com. You can go there to learn more about what we're doing. Our investments are focused on products based on deep science and engineering that deliver breakthrough innovation. Again, the hardware side of the house, the physical side of the house, with a new model, as we've talked about, to kind of inspire not only more of what I do, but bring venture capital back to where it started in the first place. Our country needs it. We need it. Without it, we will be challenged. There's too much competition in the world. So you can go and learn more about it. You can join my mission. We have an IP Capital Fund that we'll be launching in the fall. And everything I'm focused on is heavily focused on things that will be of benefit to humanity. Food, medicine, energy, clothing, housing. You'd be shocked at how many innovations can change the game, and how many startups are trying to solve these problems that not only create a great economic opportunity that's been ignored for too long, but actually help humanity, and with it, help the environment. We get the best of all worlds. And that's what I like about what I'm doing. And if you want to learn about my background a little bit more, you can also go to my LinkedIn profile, Robert Cote, LinkedIn, search it in Google, you will find me. And I've got some videos. I recently did a Bloomberg a video on the close,
yeah, it's great,
talking about it, and some others about why I started this mission. And I want people to realize that I am an entrepreneur too. I know everybody's pain. I live it myself day to day, going from 0 to 1, moving the world from venture capital and digital or software back to a new kind of venture capital called IP capital. And I can tell you it's been no walk in the park. I feel everybody's pain, and I come with a humility and a desire to want to help that I think is really, really important to bring in the kind of change that I believe is possible. So
I support it and I love it. Robert, this has been an absolute blast. I really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate you coming on the show.
You're welcome. You're welcome.